He slammed his fist so hard the coffee cups rattled off the counter and shattered on the floor. Vincent Moretti, the man who made city councilmen weep and judges lose sleep, was bleeding through a $5,000 coat and screaming at a waitress who earned $11 an hour. Everyone in that diner froze. Everyone looked away. Everyone except her. Claire Bennett set down the coffee pot, looked him dead in the eyes, and said the 5 words that would change both their lives forever. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain had been coming down since 9 o'clock that evening, the kind of cold November rain that doesn't fall so much as it tacks sideways. Relentless, personal. By 2 in the morning, the streets outside Maggie's all-night diner were black rivers running between the curbs, and the industrial district of Newark looked exactly like what it was. A place the rest of the city had decided to forget about. Claire Bennett had been on her feet for 14 hours. She was working a double again, which meant she had clocked in at noon and wouldn't clock out until 6 in the morning. Assuming no one called in sick, and assuming the dishwasher didn't break down for the 3rd time that week. Her left shoe had a split along the inner sole that she'd been ignoring for 2 months because she couldn't afford to replace it. Every time she took a step on the wet tile behind the counter, she could feel the cold seeping through to her sock. She didn't complain about it. She didn't complain about most things anymore. Complaining took energy, and energy was the one thing she was always running out of. There were 4 customers in the diner at 2:14 in the morning. A truck driver named Gerald who came in every Wednesday and always ordered the same thing: eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter. A young couple in the back booth who had clearly been arguing before they walked in, and were now eating their pancakes in that careful, loaded silence that meant the argument wasn't over, just resting. And an older man at the far end of the counter named Pete, who drank decaf and read the same newspaper he'd brought from home, because, he said, the diner's copy was always missing the sports section. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that Claire had learned to appreciate, even depend on, in the deep night hours, when the city finally wore itself out and left the all-night places to the people who had nowhere else to be. She was refilling Pete's coffee when the door blew open. Not opened. Blew open like something had hit it from the outside with considerable force, or like the storm itself had decided it was done waiting on the sidewalk. The wind rushed in, wet and sharp, and knocked a stack of paper napkins off the hostess stand. Rain followed in a diagonal sheet, and then 3 men walked through the door. Claire noticed the first 2 before she noticed the third. They were large men, the kind of large that wasn't about fitness but about consequence, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of faces that had learned long ago not to show anything. One of them, a man with a thick jaw and close-cropped gray hair, was already scanning the diner before he fully stepped inside. His eyes moved to the back booth, to the counter, to the kitchen window, to the emergency exit near the bathrooms. He did it fast and smooth, the way people do when they've been trained to assess rooms for danger before they've assessed them for anything else. The man behind him, younger, with restless hands that kept moving toward the inside of his coat, and then catching themselves, held the door open. And then Vincent Moretti walked in. Claire knew who he was the same way everyone in Newark knew who he was, not from photographs, which were almost impossible to find, and not from any official record, but from the particular silence that seemed to travel with him. She'd heard his name her whole life, the way you hear the names of weather systems and viruses, always at a distance, always described in terms of what they had already destroyed. He was taller than she expected. Brooder. His black coat was the kind of expensive that most people in Newark would never hold in their hands, but it was soaked through from collar to hem, which made him look less like a man of power and more like a man who'd been caught somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. His dark hair was plastered flat against his forehead, and his left arm, held slightly away from his body at an angle that wasn't natural, had blood soaking through the white sleeve of his dress shirt, dark and wet and spreading. He sat down at the counter, not asked to be seated, not waited for anyone to direct him. He simply sat, the way a man sits when he has spent his entire life in rooms where the furniture rearranged itself around him rather than the other way around. The large man with the gray hair, Ray Sullivan, though Claire wouldn't learn his name until later, positioned himself near the door. The younger man stayed close to Vincent's right side, but took a half step back, the way bodyguards do when they want to be invisible without actually being absent. Gerald the truck driver found something very interesting to study in his eggs. The arguing couple went motionless. Pete's newspaper didn't move. Claire walked to the counter. She had learned, over 11 years of waiting tables, that the best thing you could do with a difficult customer was get there fast. Not because speed would solve anything, but because the longer you left a difficult customer sitting alone with their difficulty, the larger it grew. She'd seen it happen with drunk college kids who turned belligerent when ignored, and she'd seen it with exhausted fathers who came in looking for a fight with anybody who was handy. The principle was always the same. You walked toward it. You didn't let it build. "Coffee?" she said. Vincent Moretti looked at her. His eyes were dark, the kind of dark that made it hard to tell where the iris ended and the pupil began. There was pain in them, real, physical pain, the kind that makes a man's jaw tight and his breathing shallow. But there was also something underneath the pain that she couldn't quite name yet. Something watchful. Something that was taking inventory. "Coffee," he said. "And towels. And whatever first aid supplies you have behind that counter." His voice was controlled. The control itself told her how much effort it was costing him. Claire poured the coffee without rushing. She set the mug in front of him and then turned to check the shelf beneath the counter, where Maggie kept the basic emergency supplies, the kind of place that had been open for 30 years. Always kept something, even if it was nothing impressive. "We've got gauze," she said, pulling out the kit. "Burn cream, aspirin, and surgical tape. That's it." She set the kit on the counter between them and looked at his arm. "That's going to need more than gauze," she said. "Then give me what you have," he said. "You need a hospital. I need you to stop arguing with me and give me what you have." The room was so quiet that Claire could hear the rain on the windows. She looked at him again, at the pain, at the exhaustion underneath the control, at the blood that was still spreading, and she made a decision that she wouldn't fully understand until much later. She didn't reach for the gauze yet. She put both hands flat on the counter and held his gaze. "The gauze I can give you," she said. "The arguing you're going to have to live with, because it comes with the service." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite amusement. It was closer to surprise. Ray Sullivan moved slightly from his position near the door. It wasn't a threatening movement, but it was a movement. Claire noticed it without looking at him directly. "I'll be right back," she said. And she walked to the back hallway where the lockers were, where she kept her personal things. She had a small first aid kit that was better than the one under the counter. She'd built it herself over 2 years, after her mother had gotten sick, and she'd learned that it was better to be prepared than to scramble. Better bandages, proper antiseptic, actual medical tape, rather than the cheap dollar store kind. She brought it back to the counter. She began to work on his arm without asking permission. Not because she didn't respect his autonomy, but because the blood had already told her there was no time for the kind of conversation that began with whether it was all right to help someone. She cut the sleeve away from the wound with the small scissors from her kit. It was a deep laceration. Not a gunshot wound, as she first feared, but the result of something sharp, glass maybe, or metal that had opened the flesh along the outer forearm in a jagged line about 4 inches long. "This should have stitches," she said. "Do what you can. I'm telling you what I'm seeing, and I'm telling you to do what you can." She cleaned the wound. She used the antiseptic without warning him, because she'd learned that warnings sometimes made things worse. He barely reacted. His breathing changed. She felt it more than heard it, but his expression didn't move. "You've been hurt before," she said. It wasn't a question. "Everyone has. Not like this. You'd be surprised," he said, "what people learn to live with." She began closing the wound with the butterfly strips from her kit, pressing each one carefully across the gap in the skin and holding it until it sealed. It was slow work. She could feel his eyes on the top of her head while she worked. "You're good at this," he said. "I was going to be a nurse," she said. And then, because she didn't want to have that conversation in front of 3 strangers in the middle of the night, she said nothing else and kept working. She was halfway through the last butterfly strip when Vincent shifted on the stool, a sudden, involuntary movement, like he'd forgotten for a moment where he was, and his elbow caught the coffee mug. The mug hit the counter with a crack, and the coffee went across the surface in a spreading, dark wave. "Be careful," Claire said without looking up. "I just mopped that floor." "Then get me more coffee and watch where you're putting the mug," he said. and his voice had changed. There was heat in it now. The kind that came from pain looking for somewhere to go. Claire finished the last strip, pressed it flat, and set down her scissors. She looked at him. She was 34 years old. She had spent the last 7 of those years in this diner, working doubles and holidays, and the graveyard shifts that no one else wanted. She had been yelled at by customers who'd had bad days, and customers who'd simply decided that she was an acceptable target for whatever was wrong with their lives. She had been ignored, talked over, undertipped, and occasionally followed to her car by men who seemed to believe that a woman working alone at 2 in the morning owed them something. She had smiled through all of it. She had bitten her tongue through all of it. She had told herself that patience was a skill, and that skills built character, and that character was what you had left when everything else was gone. Something in her had been building for 7 years. It picked this particular moment to arrive. She looked at Vincent Moretti, the most dangerous man in the state of New Jersey, according to people who tracked such things, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt done, not afraid, not deferential, not careful. Done. "I have been on my feet for 14 hours, she said. Her voice was completely level. "I have mopped that floor twice tonight. Once because somebody's kid knocked over a milkshake, and once because the dishwasher backed up into the kitchen. I just bandaged your arm with my own supplies, because yours were inadequate, and if you raise your voice at me one more time in my diner, I will end you." The words came out clean and quiet, and completely without performance. She wasn't trying to be brave. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling the truth, the way you tell the truth when you've stopped caring what it costs you. The room stopped breathing. Ray Sullivan's right hand disappeared inside his coat. The arguing couple had their eyes locked on Claire with the particular expression of people watching something they can't believe and can't look away from simultaneously. Vincent Moretti looked at her for a long, measureless moment. And then he said very quietly, "Ray." Ray's hand came back out of his coat, empty. Another silence, longer this time. And then Vincent Moretti laughed. It wasn't the laughter of a man who found something amusing. It was deeper than that, rougher than that. The laughter of a man who had forgotten what surprise felt like and just been reminded. It came from somewhere real, somewhere that the years of control hadn't quite managed to reach. "She'll end me," he said, not to anyone in particular, mostly to the air between them. "In 14 hours on her feet, she'll end me." Claire did not smile. She picked up the coffee pot. "You want that refill or not?" she asked. He looked at her. Really looked, the way people look when they're trying to understand something that doesn't fit the category they've already prepared for it. And something in that look began a process that neither of them could have named yet, and neither of them was ready for. "Yes," he said. "Please." She poured the coffee, he drank it. She finished her shift. The couple in the back left 40 minutes later, and she noticed they were holding hands when they walked out. Gerald, the truck driver, left her a $20 on a $16 check. Pete folded his newspaper and said goodnight the way he always did, without looking up. Vincent Moretti, before he stood from the stool at the counter, reached inside his coat with his unbandaged arm. He placed something under the coffee cup without making a show of it. Then he stood, adjusted his ruined coat, and walked out into the rain with his 2 men. Claire lifted the coffee cup. $500, folded clean. She stood looking at it for a long time. She thought about calling it in, about leaving it for Maggie, about dropping it in the donation jar by the register. She thought about what it meant that a man like Vincent Moretti had reached into his coat and left it there, and whether taking it made her something, and whether leaving it made her something different. In the end, she put it in the register and wrote it down as a cash tip in the log, because that's what it was, and because pretending otherwise would have been a kind of dishonesty she didn't have the energy for. She mopped the counter where the coffee had spilled. She pulled on her coat at 5:45, stepped out into a morning that had stopped raining, but hadn't yet decided to be something better than gray, and walked to the bus stop. She did not expect to see Vincent Moretti again. She was wrong about that. At exactly 2:14 the following night, the diner door opened. No storm this time, no blood, no armed men standing by the entrance. Just Vincent Moretti alone, in a different coat, still slightly damp from the walk, from wherever he'd come from. He sat on the same stool. Claire was already reaching for the coffee pot before she'd consciously registered who it was. She set the mug in front of him and poured without speaking. He wrapped both hands around the mug, His bandaged arm, she noticed, was held more carefully than the other. And he looked at the counter for a moment before he looked at her. "I came to apologize," he said. She had been waiting tables for 11 years. She had heard apologies of every variety: performative apologies, manipulative apologies, reflexive apologies from people who apologized for everything, because it had become a nervous habit. She had heard apologies offered like transactions, like they were buying something with the words. She had not heard an apology that sounded like this one. It was short, it was plain, it didn't reach for justification or explanation or context. It was simply, "I came to apologize." She poured herself a coffee, something she rarely did during a shift, because caffeine after midnight made it harder to sleep when she finally got home, and she leaned against the counter across from him. "For which part?" she asked. He considered this. "The shouting," he said. "That wasn't acceptable." "No," she agreed, "it wasn't. You were right to say what you said." "I know I was." Another silence, but this one was different from the silences of the night before. That silence had been charged, ready to break in any number of directions. This one was something steadier. Not comfortable, exactly. But not dangerous either. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck passed on the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. He watched the light come and go before he answered. "Because I haven't slept properly in 4 years," he said. "And last night, sitting on this stool, was the closest I've come." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at him, at the exhaustion that was visible now that he wasn't in pain, that lived in the set of his shoulders and the space around his eyes, and she thought about what it must cost a man to admit something like that to a stranger who had threatened to end him 12 hours earlier. "I need somewhere to sit," he said. "1 hour. Every night if it's possible. Somewhere that doesn't ask me for anything." "Everyone who sits at this counter is asking for something," Claire said. "Usually it's eggs. You know what I mean." She did know what he meant. She'd been around enough exhausted people, her mother. During the worst of the illness, the long-haul truckers who came in with 300 miles behind them and 200 ahead. The nurses who came in after overnight hospital shifts with the particular blank look of people who had been carrying other people's emergencies for 8 hours to recognize what someone looked like when they needed a place to simply stop. She set her coffee cup on the counter. "There are rules," she said. He looked up at her. "No weapons where I can see them," she said. "No business meetings. No yelling at the staff. That includes me. It includes Donna, who works weekends. And it includes whatever high school kid Maggie hires to bus tables." She paused. "And you pay for your coffee the same as everyone else. No putting money under the cup like you're leaving a bribe. That was a tip. $500 is not a tip. That's a statement. I don't need statements. I need $1.50, same as I charge everyone else." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she would try to describe later, to herself, in the quiet of her apartment, and never quite managed to get right. Not admiration exactly. Not submission. Something closer to recognition, the particular look of someone who has just heard a rule they've been wanting someone to set for a very long time. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. She refilled his coffee. He sat with it in his hands and looked at the counter and didn't speak. And Claire went back to her work, wiping tables, refilling the sugar dispensers, checking on the couple in the corner who'd come in for late pie. At 3:17, exactly 1 hour after he'd arrived, Vincent Moretti stood from his stool. He placed $1.50 on the counter beside the empty mug. He left without another word. Claire watched the door close behind him and stood in the middle of her clean, quiet diner and tried to figure out what had just happened to her ordinary night. The thing about Vincent Moretti was that he came back every night after that. And the thing about Claire Bennett was that she let him. Not because she was naive about what he was. She wasn't. She'd grown up in Newark, which meant she'd grown up in the long shadow of people like him, the kind of shadow that doesn't fall from a single man but from the whole cyst of fear and convenience and willingness to looks the other way that makes men like him possible. She knew what he was, but she also knew what she saw at that counter every night at 2:14, and what she saw was a man who was trying, in the only way he currently knew how, to find somewhere that wasn't defined by what he could take or threaten or buy. She didn't think that was enough. She didn't think it excused anything. But she'd spent enough time around people in the process of becoming something different to know that the beginning of it looked like this: one quiet hour, one place, with rules, One person who wasn't afraid to hold the line. She kept the line. The first week, their conversations were transactional. Coffee, one refill. $1.50. Good night. She asked nothing. He offered nothing. It was exactly what they'd agreed to. The second week, something started to crack open at the edges. It started as many things started with Claire, because she was observant. She had spent 11 years watching people at their most tired and least guarded, which meant she had become very good at noticing things that people didn't intend to show. She noticed that on the fourth night of the second week, Vincent set his coffee cup down with a particular carefulness that wasn't his usual controlled precision. It was the carefulness of a man who's been riding something at the edge of his control and is very quietly white-knuckling it. His breathing was different, shallow. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with pain. She'd seen it before many times. In her mother, during the hospital stays. In a nurse she'd befriended during those years who said she'd started having them at work and hadn't told anyone because she was afraid what it would mean. Panic attacks didn't look like people thought they looked. They didn't look like drama. They looked like someone trying very hard to hold very still while something inside them screamed. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't say anything about what she thought she was seeing. She simply topped off his coffee, set the pot down, leaned her elbows on the counter, and said, in a conversational tone, "My mother used to do this thing when she couldn't breathe right. She'd put her hands flat on the nearest surface and push down, not hard, just enough to feel the resistance. And she'd breathe out longer than she breathed in. 4 counts in, 7 counts out." She paused. "Doctors call it something. I just call it the thing that worked." She went back to the register to check her receipts. She didn't look at him again for 2 minutes. When she did look, he had both hands flat on the counter, pressing down. Lightly, steadily, and his breathing was different. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But on the following nights, she noticed that when he came in and the thing, whatever it was close to the surface, he would put his hands on the counter first, before he reached for the coffee, and the breathing would shift. And by the time she'd poured the cup, he would be looking a little more like himself. She cataloged these things the way she cataloged everything, not sentimentally, not strategically, but simply because noticing had always been her most reliable skill. The week after that, Vincent arrived with a book tucked under his arm. A nursing textbook. 2nd edition, battered but clean. He set it on the counter between them without preamble, without explanation, without looking at her. "It's a loan," she said before he could say anything. He looked up. "What?" "Whatever this is," she said, "it's a loan. Not a gift. Write that inside the cover." He looked at her. He looked at the book. He reached into his coat for a pen, she realized, and he opened the cover and wrote 2 words in a careful, angular hand. "A loan." She took the book and put it in her bag under the counter, without looking at it again. He watched her do it. Something passed across his face that she decided not to examine too closely. "Not yet." "Why nursing?" he asked. It was the most direct personal question he'd asked her. She thought about whether to answer, and she decided that the decision had already been made somewhere between the breathing exercise and the book, and the $1.50 every night. And she might as well be honest. "Because I'm good at it," she said. "And because the world has a shortage of people who can keep their hands steady when everything around them is falling apart." She paused. "And because my mother died in a hospital where the nurses were too overworked to catch something they should have caught, and I thought if I were there, I would have caught it." She said it plainly, without self-pity. The way you say things when they've been inside you for so long that they've stopped being painful and just become true. Vincent was quiet for a long time. "What stopped you?" he asked. "Same thing that stops most people," she said. "Money. Time. Somebody who needed more help than I could afford to give while also going to school." She wiped the counter. "Life happened in the wrong order." He nodded slowly. "I know what that's like," he said. "When things happen in the wrong order." It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. She recognized it as such. She didn't make a big deal of it. "Drink your coffee," she said. "It's getting cold." He drank his coffee. She went to check on Gerald's eggs. And somewhere between the counter and the kitchen window, she allowed herself to acknowledge, for just a moment, that she had no idea what she was in the middle of. She only knew that it was something. And that something, for the first time in a very long time, made the night feel shorter than it was. 2 weeks after the nursing textbook appeared on the counter, something else happened. It was a Tuesday. She had opened up alone because Donna had called in sick, and the kitchen was running on a skeleton crew. And there was a guy named Todd who bussed tables but was too young and too new to be left with any real responsibility. The diner was quiet but not empty, never fully empty on a Tuesday at midnight, because the production crews from the industrial park down the road tended to knock off at 11 and come in for food. One of those men, she didn't know his name, had seen him maybe 4 times before, had been sitting at the bar since 11:15 and nursing a series of drinks he'd clearly started before he arrived. He was the kind of drunk that doesn't get loud or aggressive immediately, but builds toward it, the way bad weather builds, with little systems of pressure coming together. At 12:40 he grabbed her wrist. Not violently, not sexually, at least not obviously. He grabbed her wrist, the way some men grab things they think belong to them casually, assuming the grab itself is permission enough. He was saying something, she would reconstruct later, about wanting his check, about the service being slow, about how maybe she needed to be friendlier. She was already moving, already running through the calculus of how to extract her wrist without escalating, how to get him his check and get him out when she felt the shift in the air near the door. She hadn't heard Vincent come in. She rarely did. He had the particular ability of men who have spent their lives needing to move through spaces undetected, but he was there, suddenly, between her and the door, and he had covered the distance from the entrance to the counter in a time that suggested he had moved very fast. The drunk man had not yet registered him. "Let go of her arm," Vincent said. Quiet, flat. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it has never needed volume to produce the desired result. The drunk man registered him then, and to his credit, or possibly just to his instinct for self-preservation, he let go. But before Vincent could do anything further, and Claire could see from his expression and the position of his body that there was a significant probability that he was going to do something further, she stepped in front of him. Not between them. In front of him. Facing him, blocking his line of sight to the man at the counter. "I've got this," she said. He grabbed, "I've got it, Vincent." The use of his first name surprised both of them. She hadn't used it before. But she kept her eyes on his and her body between him and the drunk customer. And she waited. He was looking at her, the way he sometimes looked at her when she'd done something that didn't fit the pattern he'd assembled for her with that particular recalibration, that process of making room for something new. She turned to the drunk man. "Here's your check," she said. She put it on the counter. "Pay it and go home, and I won't remember tonight happened. Give me any other kind of trouble, and I'll call every person I know who will make your life difficult to navigate." She held his gaze until he looked away. "The coffee is on me. Have a good night," he paid. He left. Claire stood at the counter for a moment, hands flat on the surface, not looking at Vincent. She was doing the breathing thing, the one she'd told him about, the one her mother had taught her, not because she was panicking, but because her hands were shaking slightly and she needed to stop them. Then she turned around. Vincent was still standing where he'd been when she blocked him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on the door the man had just left through. "You're angry," she said. "Yes. That's allowed," she said. "But what you were about to do isn't." He looked at her. He put his hands on, "I know what he did. And I handled it. That's the difference." She walked back, behind the counter, and picked up the coffee pot. "If you come in here every night and handle things for me, I become someone who needs to be handled for. That's not a relationship. That's a hostage situation with better lighting." She poured his coffee and set it in front of him. He sat down. Slowly, like he was deciding step by step whether to keep himself in check. "You are the most infuriating person I have ever met," he said. "You've met some interesting people," she said. "I'll take that as a compliment." He looked at the counter for a long moment. And then he said something she didn't expect. "My father used to say that the only way to keep something safe was to hold it so tightly nothing could touch it." His voice was careful, even, like he was trying the words out to see if they broke. He held everything that way, his business, his name, his family. He picked up the coffee cup. Everything he held like that either cracked or ran. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that the moments when he said things like this required the same response as the breathing exercise, steady presence, no commentary, just the holding of space. "What you said," he continued, "about protection being a cage." He looked up at her. "I've been thinking about it. And I think he believed the cage was the point," Vincent said. "I think I believed it too for a long time. Because inside the cage, at least you know where everything is. She leaned on the counter and now? He was quiet. Now I'm sitting in a diner at 2 in the morning paying $1.50 for bad coffee, he said. And it's the only hour of the day where I know what I'm supposed to be. Claire Bennett had spent 14 years learning that love, real love, the kind built on something, was not what happened to you. It was what you chose, again and again, in the ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves as important. This moment, she recognized, was one of those. She didn't say that. She was nowhere near ready to say that. What she said was, "The coffee is not bad." And he almost smiled. And outside, the Newark night went on being what it was: hard and cold and indifferent to the small revolutions happening in its all-night places, while two people sat on opposite sides of a diner counter and began, without quite knowing it yet, the long, uncertain work of trusting each other. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Claire started noticing the car. It wasn't the same car every night. That was what made it take her so long to register it as a pattern, rather than coincidence. The first time, it was a dark blue sedan parked across from the diner at 1:40 in the morning. Engine off, no one getting out. She'd noticed it, the way she noticed most things peripherally, filed away without making a decision about it yet. The second time, 4 nights later, it was a black S, different plates, same position, same stillness. The third time, she wrote down the plate number on the back of a receipt and put it in her apron pocket. She didn't tell Vincent that night. She wasn't sure what she was telling him, or whether it was her business to tell him anything. The rules of their arrangement had always been clear. No business at the counter. She poured his coffee, took his $1.50, held the line. But the fourth time the car appeared, and this time it was a different model again, which meant someone was being careful about rotation. Claire realized that careful was the word that should have alarmed her from the beginning. Random vehicles didn't rotate. Random vehicles didn't know the schedule of a specific diner's night shift. Random vehicles didn't appear at 1:40 every time, which was, she'd already calculated, 35 minutes before Vincent arrived. Someone was watching the diner, and they were watching it before he got there, which meant they were watching for him. And they knew his schedule, which meant they were close enough to know things they shouldn't. She waited until the diner was empty that night, except for the two of them. She put the receipts with the plate numbers on the counter, between his coffee cup and his hands. He looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. "How long?" he said. 4 times over 12 days, she said. Different vehicles. Same spot, same arrival time, always before you get here. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It was more like a subtle reorganization, the way a building looks the same right up, until the moment you understand the structural issue, and then you can't unsee it. He picked up the receipts. He looked at each one. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "You should have been more careful about your schedule," she said. He looked up at her. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I'm making a point. You've been coming here every night at the same time for 3 weeks. In your world, patterns are vulnerabilities. If I noticed the pattern, someone else noticed it a long time before me." He folded the receipts and put them inside his coat without a word. She refilled his coffee. He sat with it for a while, not drinking, just thinking in that contained way he had, where the thinking was visible, not in his face, but in the absolute stillness of his hands. "I won't stop coming," he said finally. "I didn't ask you to." "Claire, I said I didn't ask you to." She set the pot down. "But I'm going to need you to tell me the truth about something." He waited. "Is the danger yours or mine?" she asked. "Because those are different problems." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating not whether to tell her, she thought, but how much, and in which order, and what it would mean to have said it out loud. "There's a man," he said, "in my organization. Frank Callahan. He's been running operations I didn't authorize. I've been moving to shut them down. He knows it. And he knows about this place. He knows about a lot of things he shouldn't. So the cars could be his, yes. Watching to see if you're meeting someone here. Watching to see if I'm something he can use." The word landed between them without drama, which was somehow worse. Vincent didn't flinch from it. He didn't reassure her that she wasn't at risk, which she respected. She would have believed the reassurance less than the silence. "I'll have the parking area checked," he said. "And I'll change the approach route." "That's not what I'm asking you to do." "Then what are you asking?" She looked at him directly. "I'm asking you whether the people Callahan is running those unauthorized operations against the businesses, the shop owners. I'm asking if any of them are in this neighborhood." He was quiet for a beat too long. "Vincent, there are some," he said. "People who come into this diner." Another beat. "Possibly." She looked at the counter between them. She thought about Sal, who ran the hardware store 2 blocks over and had started coming in for coffee at midnight, because he said the nights had gotten hard and he needed somewhere to sit. She thought about Mrs. Petrov from the dry cleaners, who brought Claire a piece of cake on her birthday every year and had lost 7 pounds since September, which was not the kind of weight loss that came from dieting. She thought about the patterns she'd already noticed and filed away without knowing what to do with them. "They're being extorted," she said. It wasn't a question. Vincent said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "By men using your name." "Callahan is using name," she said again. Not loud, not with anger, but with the particular precision of someone who needs a thing to be clearly stated before they'll move forward. "They're paying because of what your name means. Because of what your family built in this city. The fear is yours, Vincent. Even if Callahan is the one collecting." She watched him take that in. She watched him decide not to deflect from it, which took, she thought, more than people would assume. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." "Then fixing it means more than removing Callahan," she said. He looked at her. "Removing one man who's abusing a system doesn't fix the system," she said. "It just changes who's abusing it." The silence that followed was the heaviest one they'd had. She could feel him working through it, the implications of what she was saying, which went much further than any conversation they'd had before. Further than the rules of the counter, and the $1.50, and the carefully maintained distance between his world and her diner. "You're asking me to consider," he said slowly, "dismantling something it took my family 40 years to build. I'm asking you to consider whether controlling a city is the same thing as protecting it," she said. "Those are different questions." He stared at his coffee for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes had that quality she'd noticed a handful of times before, open, in a way that his face almost never was, like something had been moved aside that was usually fixed in place. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "I don't know who I am if that's not what I do." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. She didn't tell him she knew the answer. She didn't have it. But she held the question with him for a moment, the way she'd learned to hold the silence during the breathing exercises. Present, steady, not trying to fix what wasn't ready to be fixed. "You've got time to figure it out," she said. "Do I?" He said it quietly. Not dramatically. Just honestly. She picked up the coffee pot. "Drink your coffee," she said. "One problem at a time." He almost smiled again. It kept almost happening, that smile, like something that had been out of use for so long it needed to remember the motion first. The next 2 weeks moved faster and slower at the same time, the way time moves when you're watching something develop that you're not ready to name. Vincent had the surveillance issue quietly resolved. She didn't ask how, and she kept to the rules they'd set for themselves about not bringing his world through the diner door. But she noticed that he changed his arrival route, and on 3 occasions, she caught Ray Sullivan doing a discreet walkthrough of the parking area before Vincent came in, which she pretended not to notice. What she couldn't pretend not to notice was the heater. The diner's heating system had been deteriorating since October. Maggie had put in a call to the building maintenance company twice, and twice someone had come, looked at it, shaken their head, and said parts would need to be ordered. It was November heading into December, and the temperature behind the counter had been dropping by degrees each week until working the late shift meant wearing 2 layers under her uniform and keeping a cup of hot water near the register just to put her hands around. On a Wednesday morning, after Vincent had left and before the early breakfast shift started, 2 men in a legitimate maintenance company van arrived and spent 4 hours servicing the heating system. When they left, it ran better than it had since Claire had started working at the diner 6 years ago. Maggie received an invoice paid in full by a corporate account she didn't recognize. When she showed it to Claire, Claire looked at it for a moment and said, "I might know what that's about." And Maggie, who had known Claire for 6 years and had developed a reliable instinct for when to ask questions and when not to, simply nodded and filed the invoice away. Claire mentioned it that night. "The heater," she said when Vincent sat down. He picked up his coffee mug. "What about it?" "Someone paid to have it fixed." "Heaters break," he said. "It's winter, Vincent." He looked at her. "Rules," she said. "You remember the rules." I don't recall a rule about heating systems. The spirit of the rules. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you were wearing 2 sweaters. I counted. She looked at him. He held her gaze, and she could see that he understood he had stepped over a line, but that he had also done so deliberately, not carelessly, which meant the look she was giving him wasn't producing the effect it might have on someone less certain of their own reasoning. The intent matters, she said. Yes, he said, it does. I intended for you not to be cold. You can't fix things for me, Vincent. Not like that. Not because it's simpler than asking. I know. Then why? Because I was angry, he said. And fixing the heater was something I could do without crossing every line you've set. So that's what I did. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. There was something in that answer that was more honest than any deflection would have been, and it stopped her argument in its tracks, not because she agreed with his reasoning, but because she recognized it. She knew what it was like to be angry about something you couldn't directly address and to redirect that energy into the one thing within your reach. What were you angry about? She asked. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The extortion invoices. The businesses. I've been moving on Callahan, but it's slow. These things have to be managed carefully, or they cause other problems. He paused. There's a woman who runs a Vietnamese restaurant on Broad Street. She's been paying Callahan's crew $800 a month for 8 months. She's been watering down her sauces to cover it. Claire said nothing. She has a daughter in middle school, he said. She came to this country with nothing and built that restaurant over 15 years. His jaw was tight. $800 a month, and she thought the alternative was losing everything she'd built. Because of my name. Because of what my name means in this city. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not comfortable, not tense, something heavier than both. So you fixed my heater, Claire said. It was something I could fix today, he said. The restaurant is going to take longer. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about what it meant that a man who had spent his adult life operating through control and fear had sat on a stool in her diner and talked about an immigrant woman watering down her sauces and had sounded like he was carrying the weight of it. She thought about what it meant that she believed him. The invoices, she said. Can you show me what his operation looks like on paper, the billing structure, the business names he's using as cover? He looked at her carefully. Why? Because I've been looking at altered financial records since the night I found some in Maggie's office. He went very still. What revoices? About 4 months of them. A company called Newark Metro Services. They've been listed as a vendor for the diner cleaning products, maintenance, supply fees. Maggie's been paying them $400 a month, and she can't tell me what service they actually provide. She looked at him steadily. She thought it was standard. She's been in business 30 years. She's used to fees she doesn't fully understand. The stillness in Vincent lasted another second, and then something shifted. He set the coffee cup down. That's Callahan's company, he said. Newark Metro is one of his fronts. I know, Claire said. I figured that out about a week ago. I've been sitting on it because I wasn't sure what to do with it. Claire, I'm telling you now, she said. Because you just told me the truth about the Vietnamese restaurant, and I think that means we're past the point where I keep things from you for my own protection. She held his gaze. But here's what I need you to hear. Maggie has receipts. I have photographs of the invoices. And I'm not going to hand those over to you so they can disappear into whatever process you use for these things. This is evidence of a crime against a woman who spent 30 years building a business, and it deserves to be used properly. He was looking at her with an intensity that made the air feel denser. What are you suggesting? He said. I'm not suggesting anything yet, she said. I'm telling you what's true, and I'm telling you that I intend to handle it right. If those two things align with what you're trying to do about Callahan, then we might be able to be useful to each other. If they don't, then I'll figure it out on my own. The moment stretched. He was doing the calculation she'd seen him do before, the one behind his eyes, the one that measured risk and advantage and trust in the same motion, all at once, automatically. The way people do when they've spent years in environments where the wrong calculation cost more than money. Whatever he calculated, it tipped in the same direction she was standing. I'll bring you the paper trail on Callahan's operation, he said. Everything above board, in terms of the business structure. You can match it against what you have. And if it's enough to build a case, then we'll talk about what to do with it. I'll need a name, she said. Someone in law enforcement who isn't already in Callahan's pocket. He looked at her for a long moment. "There's a detective," he said carefully. "Laura Hayes. She's been building a case against Callahan for 2 years. She hasn't been able to get inside the financial structure because everything is buried under 3 layers of legitimate-looking paperwork. And if I walked in with the paperwork, she'd listen," he said. "She'd have to." Claire nodded slowly. She let the weight of what they'd just agreed to settle between them without rushing past it. This was not a small thing. This was both of them leaning across the line they'd carefully maintained for weeks, and neither of them pretending it wasn't. "Vincent," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "whatever we build on the other side of it, it can't be built on what your name means in this city. It has to be built on what you actually do, every day." Going forward, she held his gaze. "I need you to understand that." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, and the window glass vibrated faintly. "I understand," he said. She wasn't sure she fully believed him yet, but she believed that he meant it. And sometimes the meaning was where it started. The next morning, she found an envelope slipped under the diner's rear door. Inside was a single folded sheet with a handwritten note that said only Hayes, and a phone number. And the words in his angular, careful handwriting, "She's honest." That's rarer than it sounds. Claire put the note in the same drawer where she kept the nursing textbook and the fold receipts with the plate numbers and all the other things that had been quietly accumulating around her ordinary life, like pieces of something she hadn't agreed to build, but was apparently building anyway. She called the number that afternoon, from the parking lot of the diner on her break. A woman picked up on the second ring. "Hayes," she said. Crisp. Alert. The voice of someone who had learned to answer the phone like it might be important, because it sometimes was. "Detective Hayes," Claire said. "My name is Claire Bennett. I work at Maggie's all-night diner on Industrial Route 12. I have financial documents connected to a man named Frank Callahan, and I was told you might be interested in seeing them." A brief silence on the other end. "Who told you to call me?" Hayes said. Claire considered her answer carefully. She thought about the rules. She thought about the line between his world and hers. She thought about the note, and the phone number, and the word honest underlined in that careful handwriting. "Someone who thought you were the right person," she said, "and who had more to lose from making that call than you'd expect." Another silence. "Longer this time. Can you come in?" Hayes said. "Not to a precinct," Claire said. "Not yet. I need to understand what I'm walking into before I walk into it." "Smart," Hayes said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like the beginning of respect. "There's a coffee shop on Ferry Street called Olson's. Not a diner. Breakfast place. You know it?" "I know it. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, bring the documents." Claire thought about her double shift, which ended at 6, which meant she'd have 3 hours between clocking out and this meeting. She thought about what 3 hours without sleep would cost her, and she thought about Mrs. Petrov and the Vietnamese restaurant woman and Maggie's $400 a month in fake vendor fees. "I'll be there," she said. She hung up and stood in the parking lot for a moment, with her phone in her hand and the cold cutting through her jacket. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about how many lines she was crossing, and how many of them she was crossing willingly, and whether willingness made it better or just more complicated. She thought about what Vincent had said about not knowing who he was if it wasn't this. She thought that she knew exactly who she was. She had always known. The question had never been who, but whether the world was going to give her the room to be that person without punishing her for it. She went back inside. She put her apron on. She poured coffee for Gerald, who was early tonight, and for the couple from the corner, who were no longer arguing, who were, in fact, holding hands across the table, which she'd noticed 3 weeks ago and had been filing away in the category of things that made night shifts worth working. She made it through the shift. She always did. At 2:14 the door opened. Vincent came in alone, sat on his stool, and she poured the coffee before he'd fully settled. He set his hands flat on the counter. She watched his breathing shift. "I called her," Claire said. "Hayes. I called her this afternoon. We're meeting tomorrow morning." The something that moved across his face was not surprise. He had expected this. That was evident. What she saw instead was something closer to relief, the particular relief of a man who has set something in motion and has been waiting to see if it will move. "Okay," he said. "I didn't tell her your name. I know you didn't. But she's going to figure it out," Claire said. When I walk in with Callahan's billing structure and the altered invoices, and it matches what she's already built, she's going to know someone on the inside. Help me find the thread." "Yes," he said. "She will. And when that happens," Claire said, "you're going to have to decide very fast what side of this you're on. Because there's no version of this story where you stay exactly what you've been, and Callahan goes down for what he's done. The investigation opens. It goes where it goes. And some of where it goes is going to be your organization." He looked at his coffee. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said. Not harshly, directly. The way she said everything that mattered. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that she would turn over in her mind for many weeks afterward. He said, "My father used to say that the only men who couldn't be bought were the ones who'd already paid more than money could cover." He looked up at her. "I think I finally understand what he meant by that." She held his gaze. "Don't tell me what you're going to do," she said. "Show me." He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. And Claire went back to work, moving through her diner with her steady hands and her split shoe, and the nursing textbook in her locker, and the weight of an unfinished story pressing against the inside of her chest. And she thought about all the ordinary things she had always been poor and stubborn and precise and underestimated. And she thought that maybe those were not the obstacles and to the life she wanted. Maybe they were exactly the tools she needed for what was coming. Outside the diner, in the parking lot, a car she hadn't seen before idled for exactly 4 minutes, and then pulled away without its lights on. She didn't see it. But Ray Sullivan, positioned across the street, did. He made a call. And somewhere across the city, Frank Callahan received information that changed his strategy entirely. The waitress was no longer background. She was not coincidence. She was not irrelevant. She was the thing that could undo everything. And Callahan, who had not survived 40 years in this business by underestimating small dangers, began to make plans. The meeting with Detective Laura Hayes lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. Claire knew the exact duration, because she checked her watch when she sat down and again when she stood up, a habit from years of tracking table turns during rush hours. She'd arrived at Olson's coffee shop on Ferry Street at 8:58, ordered a black coffee she didn't touch, and laid the documents on the table between them, in a neat stack, the altered invoices, the Newark Metro Services billing records, the plate numbers from the surveillance vehicles, and 3 months of cross-referenced delivery schedules she'd reconstructed from Maggie's vendor logs. Hayes had picked up the first page and not put it down for 40 minutes. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with short natural hair going silver at the temples and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to make themselves unreadable in rooms full of people who were trying to read her. She looked at Claire's documents, the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, not searching for what was there, but confirming what she already suspected. "This billing structure," Hayes said, without looking up. "The rotation of service categories. You see how they swap between maintenance, supply, and consulting every 3 months? So no single line item is large enough to flag automatically," Claire said. Hayes looked up then. Looked at her properly for the first time. "You figured that out yourself," Hayes said. "I've been reading altered invoices for 6 weeks," Claire said. "The pattern isn't subtle once you know what you're looking for." Hayes set the papers down and folded her hands on top of them. "Miss Bennett, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way. All right? The person who gave you my number," Hayes said. "Are they inside the Moretti organization?" Claire held her gaze. She had thought about this moment on the bus ride over, and she had decided then what she was going to say, and she said it now without flinching. "I'm not going to answer that question today. What I will tell you is that the documents in front of you are real. They came from a business being victimized on Industrial Route 12. And the person who pointed me toward you has more to lose from this conversation than you do." Hayes studied her for a long moment. "That's a very careful answer," Hayes said. "I've been practicing," Claire said. Something moved at the corner of Hayes's mouth. Not quite a smile. "Close enough. What do you want out of this?" Hayes asked. "The businesses on Callahan's collection list get released from their debts," Claire said. "Completely. No partial arrangements, no payment plans. Released," she paused. "And Maggie Kowalski, the woman who owns the diner, gets her $400 a month back for every month she paid it. That's restitution. That's a sentencing matter, not something I can promise." "I know," Claire said. "I'm telling you what matters to me. What you do with that information is your job." She picked up her coffee finally. I'm going to need something from you too. Name it. If this goes where I think it's going to go, Claire said, and the investigation opens up into the broader organization, I need to know that the people who cooperate get that cooperation counted properly, not buried in paperwork. Hayes was quiet for a moment. You're talking about somebody specific. I'm talking about the principal, Claire said. Because I've been watching this city eat people for a long time, and I've noticed that cooperation tends to get remembered when it's convenient and forgotten when it isn't. I want it in writing before I hand you anything else. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a card and slid it across the table. Call me at this number, Hayes said. Not the other one. This one. Anytime, day or night. And Miss Bennett, she paused. Don't be alone in that diner at night anymore. Not until this moves. Claire picked up the card. She looked at it for a moment and thought about the split sole in her shoe, and the nursing textbook in her locker, and the unopened acceptance letter she still hadn't dealt with. And she thought about how strange it was that a person could spend years being invisible, and then in the space of 6 weeks become exactly the kind of person that people with power suddenly needed to pay attention to. I'll be fine, she said. She believed it when she said it. She was wrong. 2 nights later, Vincent didn't show up at 2:14. At 2:20, Claire refilled Pete's decaf and told herself it was traffic. At 2:28, she wiped the counter for the 3rd time and told herself the route change sometimes added minutes. At 2:35, she called the number she had for Ray Sullivan. She'd gotten it 3 weeks ago. For practical reasons, she hadn't examined too closely, and it went straight to voicemail. At 2:40, the door opened. 2 men she'd never seen before. Not customers. She knew the difference between someone who walked into a diner for food and someone who walked into a diner for a different reason entirely. And these 2 walked in like men who had already decided what was going to happen and were now performing the formality of making it look casual. One was tall and wide through the chest, with a heavy jaw and pale eyes that moved around the room before his feet had fully stopped. The other was younger, sharper-faced, with the particular restlessness of someone who was new to this kind of work and compensating for inexperience with attitude. They sat at the counter. Claire walked over. Coffee, she said. Sure, the tall one said. He looked at her the way people look when they know something you don't know they know. You're Claire? I'm the waitress, she said. You want coffee or not? We want to ask you a couple questions. This is a diner, she said. Not a question place. Coffee, food, or out the door. The younger one leaned forward. We heard you know Vincent Moretti pretty well. The room was not empty tonight. Gerald was at the end of the counter. A woman named Sandra, who worked night dispatch somewhere, was in the corner booth. Todd was in the back running the dishwasher. Claire calculated all of this in the time it took her to pick up the coffee pot and set it back down. I know a lot of customers, she said. I'm bad with names. Right, the tall one said. He wasn't smiling anymore. Here's the thing, Claire. We need you to come with us. Take a little ride. Answer some questions for a friend of ours. And then we bring you right back. Gerald had gone very still at the end of the counter. Claire's hands were completely steady. This was the thing about having spent years being afraid not of specific men in specific moments, but of all the accumulated ways the world told poor women they didn't have options. She had long since moved past the kind of fear that made hands shake. What she felt right now was sharper and cleaner than fear. It was clarity. I'm not going anywhere, she said. The younger one reached across the counter and grabbed her wrist. Gerald stood up. Sit down, old man, the tall one said, without looking at him. Gerald sat down. But his phone was in his hand, and Claire saw it, and she held the younger man's grip on her wrist and looked at Gerald and gave the smallest nod she had in her repertoire. Gerald dialed. Let go of my arm, Claire said to the younger one. Her voice was completely level. I'm going to count to 3. 1 lady 2. The tall one started to come off his stool. Claire threw the coffee pot. Not at either of them. She threw it past them, toward the floor between the counter and the door, and the hot coffee spread across the freshly mopped tile in a spreading dark wave. The tall man, who had been mid-motion, stepped directly into it, and his shoe hit the wet tile wrong, and he went down sideways with the particular uncontrolled motion of a man who cannot catch himself fast enough. The younger one released her wrist. She was already moving. Around the counter, through the kitchen door, into the back hallway. She hit the silent alarm panel, a system Maggie had installed 5 years ago after a late-night robbery that nobody in the neighborhood liked to talk about, and then she pulled the kitchen door shut behind her and turned the lock. She could hear them at the door, testing the handle, talking to each other in low, urgent voices. She had her phone out. She dialed Hayes first, because Hayes had said anytime, and this was anytime. It rang twice. Hayes, it's Claire Bennett. 2 men at the diner. They told me to come with them. I'm locked in the kitchen. Address, she gave it. Stay on the line, Hayes said. Do not open that door. From the front of the diner, she heard a crash, something knocked over, or thrown, and then Gerald's voice, sharp and loud, saying something she couldn't make out. Sandra, the dispatch woman, was talking fast. She could hear the particular strained quality of voices, trying to manage a situation they hadn't planned for. Then the back door of the diner, the delivery entrance, which she had locked at 9 o'clock and double-checked at midnight, rattled hard on its hinges. Claire backed away from it. Her phone was still pressed to her ear. Hayes, they're at the back door. We're 4 minutes out, Hayes said. Claire, listen to me. Find a corner, stay away from the doors, keep your phone on. 3 minutes was a long time. She had worked in this kitchen for 6 years, and she knew its geography better than she knew most things about her life. She moved to the far corner near the industrial refrigerator, where she had a direct sightline to both doors, and she put her back against the wall, and she breathed. 4 counts in, 7 counts out, steady. The back door hit its hinges again, harder. She thought about Vincent. She thought about the fact that he hadn't arrived, and Ray wasn't answering, and these 2 men had known her name and known to come here tonight. She thought about Ray standing across the street and watching a car pull away without its lights, and she thought about what she knew about what that meant, and she felt something cold move through her. That wasn't fear of this room or these men, but something larger and more structural, the understanding that this was not random, that this had been planned, and that the plan had a shape she couldn't yet see. The back door stopped rattling. She didn't find this reassuring. 30 seconds later, the kitchen door from the front of the diner shuddered, not rattling, but a single heavy impact, like a shoulder. And then Vincent's voice on the other side of it, controlled and tight, and cutting through wood, like it was nothing. Claire, it's me. Open the door. She crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and turned the lock and pulled the door open. He looked the way she'd seen him look once before, that first night, coat soaked, jaw tight, something in his posture that was pure controlled velocity, a body that had been moving very fast and had just forced itself to stop. There was no fresh blood this time, but the quality of his stillness had that same dangerous charge to it. Ray was behind him. The tall man was on the floor near the counter, being held there by the combined weight of Gerald, who turned out to be considerably more capable than his retirement age appearance suggested, and his own apparent inability to navigate wet tile. The younger one was gone. One got out, Ray said. I know, Vincent said. He was looking at Claire. Are you hurt? I'm fine, she said. They grabbed my wrist. They wanted me to go with them. His jaw tightened in a way she had learned to read. Callahan's men, he said, I figured. She kept her voice even. Where were you? You're always here at 2:14. There was a call, he said. A supposed meeting. One of my captains, urgent. I was already across town when Ray called me. She looked at him. It was a distraction, yes. To get you away from here. Yes, she let that sit for a moment. The calculation of it. The deliberateness. The fact that someone had watched closely enough and long enough to know that Vincent being in this diner was the variable that needed to be removed before they could move on her. She thought about what that meant, about how much information Callahan already had, and how long he'd been sitting on it, and what exactly he intended to do with her if those men had gotten her out the door. From the front of the diner came the first sound of approaching sirens. They'll be here in 2 minutes, Claire said. She still had Hayes on the phone, and she put it back to her ear. Detective Hayes, we're clear. 2 men, 1 detained, 1 ran. Vincent, she paused 1 beat. Moretti is on scene. A very short silence on Hayes's end. I'll be there in 8 minutes, Hayes said. Don't let anyone leave. Claire lowered the phone and looked at Vincent. She's coming, Claire said. He held her gaze. I know what that means. Yes, she said, it does. He nodded once. He didn't move toward the door. He stayed exactly where he was. And she thought that this decision to stay, to not run, To not use the 2 minutes before the sirens arrived, to disappear into the night, the way he'd been disappearing in alt life. This was one of those actions she'd told him she needed to see. She noticed it. She filed it somewhere important. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos. 3 patrol cars, Hayes, 2 additional detectives. The tall man was cuffed and put in a car. Gerald gave a statement that was remarkably detailed for a man who'd been eating eggs. Sandra from dispatch was useful in ways that validated Claire's private theory that people who worked communications were never as detached from events as they appeared. Hayes spoke with Vincent for 11 minutes in the corner of the diner, while Claire gave her own statement to a detective named Park, who had the patient, precise manner of someone who had been taking statements for a long time and had learned to let the details come in, whatever order they arrived. She told him everything: the wrist grab, the coffee pot, the kitchen door, the back door, the timing of Vincent's absence and the distraction call. Park wrote it all down. She watched Hayes and Vincent across the room while Park wrote. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She could read body language, though, and what she read was not comfortable. Hayes, leaning slightly forward, direct, the posture of someone extracting rather than receiving. Vincent standing very still with his hands at his sides, the posture of someone who had decided to let themselves be extracted from. When Hayes came back, she looked at Claire with an expression that was several things at once. "The man we detained," Hayes said, "is going to talk. He's been with Callahan for 3 years, which means he knows enough to be very useful, if he decides being useful is in his interest." She paused. "He also said something, before I could stop him from saying things." "What did he say?" Claire asked. "He said that tonight was supposed to be a distraction," Hayes said. "Not just to get Moretti away from here. The real target tonight was a warehouse on the industrial waterfront. Moretti's most loyal men, 6 of them, were told to be there for a meeting at 3 in the morning. Claire went very still. "The meeting doesn't exist," Hayes said. "Callahan arranged it. He has 12 men waiting at that warehouse right now." Claire turned and found Vincent with her eyes across the room. He was already looking at her, which meant Hayes had already told him, or he'd heard from Ray, or he'd simply felt it the way he felt most things, that particular instinct of a man who had lived his entire life in rooms where the air changed before the danger announced itself. She walked to him. "You know," she said. "Ray just got the call," he said. His voice was low, controlled. She could feel the effort of the control, not the performed stillness of a man hiding fear, but the active work of a man choosing not to let anger override calculation. "6 of my people. Walking into an ambush. Can you reach them?" "2 of them, maybe. The other 4 are already in transit. They cut the communication before Ray could." He stopped. "It was planned very carefully. How long do we have?" 40 minutes, Ray said, from behind Vincent's right shoulder. Hayes had come to stand beside Claire. "My operation wasn't ready for tonight," she said directly. "We were 2 days out from moving on Callahan. Now he's forcing the timeline." "Then we adjust the timeline," Claire said. Everyone looked at her. She had spent 14 years thinking fast in chaotic situations. She had managed kitchen crises, medical emergencies, customer meltdowns, equipment failures, and 2 actual small fires. She had learned, through all of it, that the instinct to panic wasted the one resource that actually mattered in a crisis, which was the few seconds of clear thinking you had, before everything moved too fast to stop. She was using those seconds now. "The warehouse," she said. "What's the layout?" Hayes and Vincent exchanged a look. Something passed between them that was complicated and fast, and it was Hayes who answered. "Loading facility. 4 entry points, multiple interior levels. Callahan's men will have the high ground if they're already positioned inside." "And the waterfront side," Claire said. "Service gates," Hayes said. "All but 1 appear on the official map as locked and inactive." "Appear," Claire said. "One of them has been used for off-schedule deliveries," Hayes said slowly. "But it's not on any public record. Only people with direct access to the facility's internal delivery logs would know it's in use." Claire felt something slot into place. The same feeling she got when a pattern in an invoice revealed itself, the sudden clarity of connected information. "Vincent," she said, "your trucking company. It services the waterfront district." "Yes," he said. "The delivery schedules, the ones you use for the legitimate operations. Do they include that facility?" He looked at her. "Yes. Every Tuesday. And Callahan has been routing his illegal shipments through your trucks without your knowledge." "That's what the financial documents showed, yes." So his men know your trucks, Claire said. They know your routes. They know which gates your drivers use because they've been watching them for months. She looked at Hayes. And the gate that appears locked on the map but isn't, is it on the Tuesday route? Hayes stared at her. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. Fast, 3 steps away while it connected. Claire heard her say, I need the service gate access logs for the waterfront facility. Industrial Gate 7. All entries for the last 6 months. Right now. Vincent was looking at Claire with that expression she'd seen before, the one she still didn't have the right word for. The one that was in the neighborhood of recognition but wider than that. You think Callahan's escape route is through that gate, he said. I think Callahan didn't build tonight as an ambush only, she said. I think he built it as a clean exit. He gets rid of your most loyal people. He walks through the gate. Nobody's watching because nobody knows it exists on paper, and he's on the waterfront in a boat or a vehicle before your observational can respond. Ray made a sound that was not quite a word. Vincent said very quietly, he's been planning this for months. He's been watching everything, Claire said. Your schedule, my schedule, the trucks, the routes, the document structure. He built this very carefully. She held his gaze, which means we have to move in the next 20 minutes. Hayes came back. Gate 7 shows 17 entries in the last 4 months, she said. All on Tuesdays. Last Tuesday, a vehicle with a Moretti logistics plate was logged at 3:42 in the morning. She paused. That's not a delivery window. Your drivers knock off at 11. Callahan's men used the truck plate as cover, Ray said. And tonight, Hayes said, that gate is our window. She looked at Claire. If you're right, I'm right, Claire said. Not arrogantly, with the particular certainty of someone who has been reading patterns long enough to know the difference between a guess and a read. Hayes was already on her radio. Vincent was looking at her. You should go to a safe location, he said. Ray can take you somewhere until. Stop, Claire said. He stopped. I'm not cargo. You've heard me say that. You've heard me explain it. I'm going to the surveillance station with Hayes, and I'm going to be useful because I have more context on those delivery logs and that financial structure than anyone on Hayes's team. And this is going to go better if you use what you have instead of protecting it into uselessness. He held her gaze for a long moment. If something happens, he started. Something already happened, she said. 2 men came into my diner tonight. Something has already happened, Vincent. The question now is what happens next. He nodded. One slow nod. Accepting what he couldn't argue with because it was true. Ray had the car running. Hayes had 3 units repositioning. The man who'd been detained in the diner, in the back of a patrol car outside, had started talking with the particular urgency of someone who'd realized, belatedly, that loyalty to the losing side was an investment strategy with poor returns. Gerald was still at the counter. As Claire pulled on her coat, she heard him say, to nobody in particular, best Tuesday night I've had in 20 years. She almost laughed. She was in Hayes's car 7 minutes later, a laptop on her knees with the delivery log files open, cross-referencing gate entries against the billing records she'd memorized over 6 weeks of double shifts and quiet study in the back of a diner. Somewhere ahead of them, in the dark waterfront district, 6 of Vincent's men were walking into a warehouse they thought was safe. And somewhere further ahead, Frank Callahan was watching, and waiting, and preparing to walk through a gate he believed no one knew about. He was wrong about that. But the next 40 minutes were going to be the longest of Claire Bennett's life. And she couldn't know yet how many of them she was going to spend, holding pressure against a wound and telling someone to keep their eyes open. She pressed her hands flat against her knees to keep them steady. 4 counts in, 7 counts out. She was ready. The drive to the waterfront took 11 minutes. Claire spent every one of them with her eyes on the laptop screen, running delivery log entries against the billing records she'd spent 6 weeks memorizing. Hayes drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding her radio, coordinating 3 units repositioning toward the industrial waterfront, while her partner, a quiet man named Detective Reyes, sat in the passenger seat and didn't say a word, which Claire appreciated because she needed to think. At 3:00 in the morning, she found it. Hayes, she said. Talk to me. Gate 7 wasn't just used on Tuesdays, Claire said. Look at this, 11 entries over 4 months, all coded as Moretti logistics vehicles. But 3 of those entries are on days that aren't Tuesday delivery days. Wednesdays, once a Saturday. She turned the laptop slightly. Callahan's crew was using the gate for secondary runs, things that couldn't wait for the regular Tuesday window. Meaning they have standing access, Hayes said. Someone inside the facility gave them codes. Someone who works facility management, Claire said. Cross-reference the Saturday entry with the facility staff roster, and you'll find who. Hayes handed her radio to Reyes. Run that, she said. Saturday 3 weeks ago, Gate 7 access. Cross with facility employee roster. Reyes was already on it. In the back, Claire pressed her hands flat on the laptop keys and thought about Vincent. He was in Ray's car somewhere behind them. Hayes had made it very clear, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that Vincent's involvement in the operational response was limited to providing information about his own organization's assets in the area. He was not to enter the facility. He was not to engage with Callahan's men. He was to stay in the car. He had agreed to these conditions with a stillness that told Claire it was costing him considerably. She understood that. She understood that a man who had spent his entire adult life as the one who moved the pieces was now being asked to sit in a parked car while other people moved them. She understood how that felt. She'd spent years watching other people make decisions about her life from a distance, and she felt for him in a way that she kept at a specific arm's length. Because right now she needed to be useful, and feeling things was a secondary project. Reyes looked up from the radio. Saturday access on Gate 7 matches a keycard registered to a facility manager named Dennis Pruitt. He's been employed there for 9 years. No record, no flags, he paused. His brother-in-law has 2 priors connected to Callahan's operation. There it is, Hayes said. We need Pruitt secured before Callahan uses that gate, Claire said. If he knows we've ID'd him, he'll close the access or change the codes. Already moving, Hayes said, and she was back on the radio. At 3:09 they got word from the first unit at the warehouse perimeter. Callahan's men were confirmed inside 8 of them, positioned on the upper level of the loading facility. Vincent's 6 men were approaching from the eastern access road. The ambush was 4 minutes from activating. 3 of the 6 had been reached by phone and redirected. 3 had not. Who couldn't you reach? Claire asked, when Ray's voice came through Hayes's radio with the update. Ray named them. 2 of them she didn't know. The third was a man Ray had described to her once, indirectly, the one who'd been with Vincent's family for 23 years, who drove Vincent's father to the hospital the night he died, who had stayed when every reasonable calculation said leaving was the smarter move. His name was Dom. She watched Hayes's face when Ray said the name, and Hayes's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened by a fraction. He's inside already, Hayes said. 2 minutes ago, Ray confirmed. All 3 of them. The radio crackled. Hayes looked at Reyes. He looked back at her. Something moved between them. That was the particular communication of partners who'd been working together long enough to have whole conversations in a glance. We go in early, Hayes said. It wasn't a question. Protocol says, Reyes started. 3 people are about to walk into a room with 8 armed men, Hayes said. Protocol can file a complaint. She was already talking into the radio again. Coordinates and timing and positions that Claire tracked as well as she could without knowing the full operational structure. At 3:11, Claire's phone rang. Vincent. She answered immediately. I know, she said before he could speak. Hayes is moving the timeline up. Dom is in there, he said. His voice was controlled, but she had learned the specific frequency of Vincent Moretti's control well enough to hear what was underneath it. He's been with my family since before I was running anything. He doesn't deserve. I know, she said again. Hayes is handling it. Stay in the car, Vincent. A heavy. Claire. Stay in the car, she said. I need you to trust me right now the way I've been trusting you for 6 weeks. Can you do that? The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Yes, said. She hung up and looked at Hayes. How long? 7 minutes to breach, Hayes said. If the units get positioned in the next 4. And Gate 7. Second unit is on Pruitt. He's being picked up at his home right now. Hayes glanced at her in the rearview mirror. You did well on that, Bennett. Claire said nothing. She was watching the time on her phone and thinking about Dom. 23 years. A man who'd driven a dying boss to the hospital and stayed when the math said go. And she was thinking about what it must cost a person to stay in something that long. Not because the thing was good, but because loyalty was the one language they'd learned to speak fluently, and fluency in anything was hard to walk away from. At 3:16 the operation moved. Claire heard it through Hayes's radio, rather than seeing it a rapid-fire sequence of unit confirmations, position calls. The particular compressed vocabulary of law enforcement in motion that she couldn't entirely translate but could feel the shape of. Hayes pulled over and coordinated from the car, which Claire knew was because of her presence. Hayes wouldn't leave a civilian unattended in an active situation, and she felt the constraint of that. The way you feel the wall when you run into it. Sharp and immediate. "What's happening?" she said. "Units are inside," Hayes said. "East and north entry. Callahan's men are," she paused, listening. "Repositioning. They've registered the breach. Dom and the others. Pinned at the interior loading bay. They're down, but not." Hayes stopped. Her hand tightened on the radio. "Reyes, I heard," Reyes said. He was already on his phone. "What?" Claire said. "Shots fired inside," Hayes said. "One of our units." The word sat in the air of the car without moving. Claire's hands pressed flat on her knees. 4 counts in. 7 counts out. She did it twice and it helped, and she went back to the laptop and pulled up the facility layout that Hayes had forwarded to her 20 minutes ago, and she looked at with the specific focus she'd learned from years of managing chaos, not looking at the whole thing, looking at the one piece that mattered right now. The interior loading bay had 2 exits. One connected to the main floor, one connected to a service corridor that ran along the eastern wall and exited at. She traced it with her finger, a point 30 feet from gate 7. "Hayes," she said. "Bennett." "Not now." "Gates 30 feet from the service corridor, exit of the loading bay," she said. "If Dom and the others are pinned at the loading bay, and Callahan's men are repositioning." "Callahan isn't repositioning to fight. He's repositioning to run. He's going to use the breach as cover to move toward the gate." Hayes looked at the map on her own phone. Looked at it for 2 seconds. "Unit 3, she said into the radio, fast and sharp. "Service corridor, eastern wall. Do not let anyone reach the gate 7 access. Anyone. I don't care who they say they are." The confirmation came back in 4 words. At 3:22, Hayes's radio went quiet for 45 seconds. Claire had learned in the last hour that the quality of radio silence was as informative as the transmissions. This silence was the kind that meant people were moving too fast to talk. At 3:23, the silence broke. One of Hayes's units, voice tight and professional. "Suspect in custody. Gate 7. He had the door open. Callahan had made it 40 feet from freedom." Hayes exhaled. It was the only visible indication that she'd been holding anything. Claire said, "What about Vincent's men?" A longer pause from the radio. Then another unit. Different voice. 3 civilians accounted for in the loading bay. 1 with a leg wound, 2 without. Another pause. The older one. He's okay, Dom." Claire closed the laptop and leaned her head back against the seat and stared at the ceiling of Hayes's car and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of not being fine. 10 seconds of feeling the full weight of the last 2 hours, the men at the diner counter, her wrist, the kitchen floor, the sound of Hayes's radio going silent, Vincent's voice saying Dom's name with that specific frequency of a man who didn't let himself be afraid of much but was afraid of this. 10 sat back up. "I need to make a call," she told Hayes. Hayes nodded without looking at her. She dialed Ray. He answered on the first ring. "I know," he said immediately. "I just heard. He's okay. Tell him," she said. "I'm telling him right now," Ray said. "He's a pause." And in the pause, she heard something that sounded like Ray moving the phone away, and another voice lower, rougher, with the particular texture of a voice that had been holding itself rigid for 20 minutes, and was now, very carefully, unholding. "He wants to talk to you." Then Vincent's voice, Claire. Just her name. "But," he said, it contained everything that had happened the last 2 hours compressed into 2 syllables, and she felt it in her sternum like a second heartbeat. "I told you to stay in the car," she said. "I stayed in the car," he said. "The whole time." "Good, Dom's okay," she said. Yes, his voice was rough at the edges, leg wound. "He'll be fine. He's angry, which is how I know he's really fine." He yelled at Ray for 20 minutes while they were getting him out. She almost laughed. She let the almost law come all the way out because she needed it, because the alternative was something she wasn't ready for yet. "Callahan," Vincent said. "In custody," she said. Hayes's unit got him at gate 7. He had the door open. The silence on his end lasted 3 seconds. "You found the gate," he said. "The delivery logs found it," she said. "I just read them." Another pause. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line, slow, deliberate. The breathing exercise she'd taught him 4 weeks ago in a quiet diner, now in use in a parked car outside a waterfront facility at 3 in the morning. She didn't say anything about it. She never did. "I need to come to the facility," he said. "There are things Hayes is going to need from me tonight. Records, names, information about Callahan's people that she doesn't have yet." "I know," Claire said. "Talk to Hayes first. She'll set the terms." "And you?" he said. She looked out the window of Hayes's car, at the industrial waterfront and the distant movement of unit lights near the facility entrance. She thought about all the things that were about to happen, the investigation opening fully, the records coming out, the federal involvement that Hayes had mentioned twice in the last hour, with the particular precision of someone telling you what's coming without officially telling you what's coming. She thought about what that meant for Vincent's organization, his assets, his name, his standing in a city that had been built around his family's power for 40 years. She thought about what he'd said, "I don't know who I am if that's not what I do." She thought about the answer she'd had, back then, and hadn't given him. "I'll be here," she said. "Come when Hayes clears you." She hung up and handed Hayes's radio back to her, because she'd been holding it without realizing. And Hayes took it without comment. And they sat in the car together, in the particular silence of two women who had done something hard, and were now waiting for the next hard thing to arrive. "You did well tonight," Hayes said. Not warmly, factually. The kind of compliment that meant more for not being dressed up. "So did you," Claire said. Hayes almost smiled. It lasted about as long as Vincent's almost smiles, which was to say not long enough to be certain it happened, but long enough to matter. At 3:47, Vincent arrived at the facility perimeter. Hayes met him at the line and they spoke for 4 minutes. Claire watched from the car and could not hear the words, but she watched Vincent's posture through the whole conversation, and what she saw was a man who was not negotiating. He was not calculating advantage or managing the interaction toward a favorable outcome. He was standing still and answering questions, and she thought telling the truth. The full truth, not the trimmed down, strategically curated truth of a man protecting his position, but the actual truth, which left him with less cover and less leverage and less of everything except his own clear conscience. She watched him do it, and she felt something she had been keeping at arm's length for 6 weeks move considerably closer. Hayes came back to the car. She sat for a moment without starting the engine. "He's going to cooperate," Hayes said. "Fully. He'll surrender the financial records, the offshore accounts, the names of the corrupt officials Callahan had in his pocket. Everything." She paused. "He also acknowledged that some of what we find will connect directly to his own organization's operations. Things he authorized. Things his family built." "I know," Claire said. "He's going to lose a significant amount," Hayes said. "Power, assets, standing. The federal piece alone is going to take 2 years to work through." "I know," Claire said again. Hayes looked at her. "You're not going to try to fix that for him." It wasn't a question. It was Hayes assessing something. "No," Claire said. "He made those choices. All of them going back before I was born. Cooperation doesn't erase them, it accounts for them." She met Hayes's eyes. "That's different." Hayes studied her for another moment. "You're going to need to testify," she said. "About the diner. About the documents. Possibly about a night." "I know," Claire said. "I'll testify. It'll be uncomfortable." "Detective Hayes," Claire said, "I have been uncomfortable for most of my adult life. I can manage a courtroom." Hayes started the car. The drive back to the diner was quiet. Reyes fell asleep in the passenger seat, which Claire found somehow deeply humanizing. Outside, Newark was doing what it did, at 4 in the morning, running on its skeleton crew of cab drivers, overnight workers, and people whose lives happened in the hours that everyone else had given up on. She thought about her mother, who had worked nights for 12 years and said that the city at 4 in the morning was the only time it told the truth. She thought that her mother had been right about most things. She thought about the acceptance letter in her locker at the diner, which had been sitting there unopened for 3 months, because opening it made it real and real things had consequences that unopened letters didn't. She thought about whether tonight had moved her closer to opening it or further away, and she decided that the question itself was the answer that she was thinking about it, which meant something in her had shifted from the position of not yet to the position of soon. Hayes dropped her at the diner at 4:22. The parking lot had 3 police cars still in it, which Maggie was going to find interesting when she arrived at 6 for the early prep. Claire made a mental note to call her before 6. She went inside. Gerald was gone. Sandra was gone. Todd had been sent home by one of the patrol officers and had apparently taken a photo of the coffee-stained floor that he'd already posted somewhere, which Claire would deal with later. The diner was empty and still, and smelled like coffee, and the particular acrid note of the wet floor from the thrown pot. She put on a fresh pot of coffee. She cleaned up the floor, not because it was her job right now, because it was technically a crime scene, and she probably wasn't supposed to touch it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. And the mop's familiar, and familiar things were what you reached for at 4:22 in the morning, when you'd been awake for 22 hours, and your wrist was bruised, and the man you'd been trying not to fall in love with was sitting somewhere across the city, deciding what kind of man he was going to spend the rest of his life being. She was on her second pass with the mop when the door opened. She didn't turn around. She knew the sound of it. Vincent sat down on his stool. She finished the section she was mopping, wrung the mop out, put it away, and poured 2 cups of coffee. She put one in front of him and kept one for herself and leaned against the counter and looked at him. He looked like a man who had just put down something very heavy. Not like a man who'd lost it, like a man who had set it down deliberately, knowing he'd have to decide whether to pick it back up. There was blood on his shirt. Left shoulder. Not the same arm as the first night. How bad? She said. Ray taped it in the car. Let me see it, Claire Vincent. Let me see it. He pulled the shirt collar aside. It was taped. Ray had done a decent job, actually, but the tape was wrong for the angle of the wound, and she could see the edge already pulling up. She went to her locker and got her kit, the same one she'd used the night they met, and she came back and stood in front of him and reapplied the tape properly without saying anything about it. He was very still while she worked. Stiller than he'd been the first night, which told her something. The first night, the stillness had been about control. This stillness was different. This was the stillness of a man who had nowhere to be for the first time in a long time and didn't know yet what to do with that. Hayes has what she needs, Claire said, without looking up from the tape. Everything, he said. Records, names, account numbers. 2 of the officials Callahan had on the payroll are going to be arrested by morning. And your organization. Federal investigators will be at the office at 9, he said. I'll be there to receive them. With your attorney? Yes, a good one? Reportedly the best in New Jersey. Good, she said. She pressed the last piece of tape flat and stepped back. You're going to need that. He looked at her. His eyes had that open quality again, the one she still hadn't found the right word for. The one that was most visible at 4 in the morning, when the control had been running at full capacity for too long and had finally run down to the reserve. The businesses, he said. The ones on Callahan's collection list. I want the money returned, all of it. Not as a legal condition, not because Hayes required it. I want it done directly, before the federal process identifies it as a recoverable asset. She looked at him. If it becomes a legal recovery, it goes into an account and gets distributed over years, he said. If I do it now, Sal at the hardware store gets his money back this week. Mrs. Petrov gets a check before she has to decide whether to close for winter. The way he said those names told her things she was going to be turning over for a long time. He'd learned them. Not as data points in an operational situation, but as people. At some point between the extortion conversation and tonight, he'd learned the names of the people being harmed by the system he'd built. The federal investigators are going to be interested in those funds, she said carefully. I have a separate account, he said. Legitimate. Fully documented, it's enough. He paused. My attorney knows about it. It'll be handled correctly. She studied him. This isn't a performance, he said. It was the first time he'd felt the need to say that, and the fact that he said it told her he understood what she was checking for. I know, she said, and she did. She also knew that knowing now didn't mean she'd stop checking later, that trust built this way, through demonstrated action rather than declared intention, required a long time and a consistent record, and one good night didn't constitute a record. She told him that, she said, Vincent, what you did tonight, cooperating with Hayes, staying in that car, choosing not to go into that warehouse yourself, those are good choices. I need you to know that they are the beginning of something, not the proof of it. He nodded. I know, because the next hard choice will come, she said, and the one after that. And every time you make the right one, that's what builds the record. Not tonight alone, I understand, he said. And there are going to be things that come out in the investigation that I'm going to have to hear, she said. Things your organization did, things your family built, that aren't going to be easy to sit with. I'm not asking you to apologize for history. I'm telling you that I'm going to need honesty about it when it surfaces. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. And affection, she said, and she said the word plainly, without softening it or qualifying it, because she had made a decision somewhere for around the 4 o'clock mark that she was done. Managing the distance affection doesn't cancel accountability. You can't care about someone enough to make their past not matter. All it does is make you willing to sit with them while they account for it. The moment was very still. Vincent looked at her for a long time without speaking. She let him look. She'd meant every word, and she wasn't going to retreat from them, and she thought that maybe one of the things he'd been waiting for, without knowing it was someone who would say a thing like that, and then stay in the room. She stayed in the room. I know, he said finally. Quietly, with the weight of a man who had spent a long time in rooms where no one said things like that, and who was only now beginning to understand what it had cost him. He picked up his coffee cup. She picked up hers. Outside, Newark was 4:45 in the morning, and the sky was doing that thing it did before dawn, where the darkness thinned, without brightening, a slow, gray becoming, neither one thing nor the other. She'd always thought that the hour before dawn was the most honest hour, because it didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It was just the process of changing. There's one more thing, Vincent said. She looked at him. Maggie, he said. She's going to retire. Claire stared at him. How do you know that? She called me, he said. And at Claire's expression, he added quickly, I didn't solicit it. She called the number I left here. I left a business card. Months ago, for general concerns, before we had our arrangement. She called and said she'd been thinking about retiring for 2 years, and that tonight had accelerated her thinking considerably. She called you, Claire said flatly. She called me, he confirmed. And she asked me to tell you that she wants to talk about the future of the diner. Claire set her coffee cup down on the counter. She looked at the diner around her, the cracked counter, and the familiar hiss of the coffee machine, and the mop she'd just used for the 4th time tonight, and the locker in the back where an acceptance letter had been. Sitting for 3 months, growing more real by the day. She thought about ownership, what it meant, what it would require, what it would give her. She thought about what she would do and what she would never do. And she made several decisions very fast. The way she made all important decisions without ceremony, without announcement, just a quiet internal settling into certainty. I'll talk to her, she said. If it would help, Vincent started. I could. No, she said. He stopped. I'll talk to her, she said again. And whatever we work out, it'll be legitimate. Documented. With a proper loan through a proper lender. She looked at him directly. No Moretti money. No favors, no ownership interests. I don't know about showing up in the paperwork 2 years from now. He held her gaze, understood. And if you help, she said, it's the kind of help you document, you declare, and you sign your name to in plain sight. No shadows, agreed, he said. She picked up her coffee cup again. She drank. She thought that the coffee was, objectively, not good. It had been sitting in the machine since she'd made it 20 minutes ago, and it had gone to that flat, slightly metallic place that late-night diner coffee always went. She thought that this was somehow exactly right. Go home, she said. Get some sleep. You have federal investigators at 9. I know, he said. He didn't move immediately. He sat with his hands wrapped around the cup and looked at the counter, and she let him sit, because she understood that for a man who had been running at full capacity for his entire adult life, the moment of stopping was sometimes the hardest part. After a while he stood. He put $2 on the counter. Then he thought about it and took one back. $1.50, she said without looking up. $1.50, he agreed. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it and turned back. Claire, she looked at him. Thank you, he said. Not for tonight. Not for the documents, or the gate, or the delivery logs, or the breathing exercise, or the nursing textbook written alone inside the cover. For all of it, she heard all of it. $1.50, she said. Same as everyone else. He almost smiled. It went all the way this time. Small and real, and the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. He left. She stood alone in her diner at 4:51 in the morning, and she finished her coffee, and she went to her locker, and she took out the nursing school acceptance letter, and she sat down on the bench and she opened it. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she put it carefully back in the envelope and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of a thing that was possible. And she thought about her mother, and about the money her mother had spent on things she didn't need. so Claire wouldn't have to need things she couldn't afford, and she thought about the Vietnamese restaurant owner watering down her sauces, and Mrs. Petrov losing 7 pounds and Maggie filing an invoice she didn't understand into a folder she'd never checked again. She thought about all the ways the world asked ordinary people to make themselves smaller so that other people's problems could take up more room. And then she thought not anymore. She put the letter in her apron pocket, next to the receipt where she'd written down the license plate numbers of the cars that had been watching the diner 6 weeks ago, and she put her apron on, and she started the coffee for the morning shift. At 6 o'clock, Maggie walked in and found the floor clean, the coffee fresh, and Claire Bennett sitting at the counter with her nursing school acceptance letter on the surface in front of her, waiting to have a conversation about the future. Maggie Kowalski sat down at the counter, looked at the acceptance letter, looked at Claire, and said, "How long has that been in your locker?" 3 months, Claire said. Maggie picked up the letter, read it, set it back down. She was 71 years old and had opened this diner when she was 40, which meant she had spent 30 people sit at this counter and make decisions about their lives. And she had developed a precise instinct who were ready to move, and the ones who were still pretending they weren't. "You're ready," Maggie said. "I know," Claire said. "Then why are we having a conversation?" Maggie said. "You already know what you want. You're sitting here waiting for me to confirm it, which you don't need, because you've never needed anyone to confirm anything for you in the 6 years I've known you." Claire looked at the letter. Then she looked at Maggie. "I want to buy the diner," she said. Maggie nodded once, like this was exactly what she'd expected, which it was. "Not all at once," Claire said. "I don't have the capital for a full purchase. I want a structured buyout. 5 years. Legitimate financing through a bank, with you holding partial note on the balance. I'll run it while I'm in school. I'll hire properly. Wages, benefits, scholarship fund I've been thinking about for 3 years." Maggie studied her for a long moment. "A scholarship fund. For employees pursuing education," Claire said. "Because I spent 7 years here, and Maggie, this diner gave me things I'm grateful for, but it also kept me in one place longer than it should have. And I don't want it to do that to the next person who walks in needing a job and finds they can't leave." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Outside, the early morning traffic was starting to build on Industrial Route 12. The coffee machine hissed and settled. "The diner is worth $240,000, Maggie said. "My accountant priced it last year." "I know," Claire said. "I looked it up." Maggie almost smiled. "Of course you did." She folded her hands on the counter. "The bank is going to want collateral, Claire. You have your apartment, which you rent. You have a car that is 12 years old and worth approximately the same as my opinion of anyone who parks in the loading zone. What are you going to put up?" "My co-signature," said a voice from the door. Both women turned. Detective Laura Hayes was standing in the entrance, still in last night's clothes, holding a coffee she'd clearly gotten from somewhere that wasn't this diner, which Claire noted as a professional slight she would address later. Hayes looked like a woman who had not slept, which was accurate, but she also looked like a woman who had closed something significant, which was also accurate. "The federal asset recovery from Callahan's operation," Hayes said, walking in and sitting 2 stools down from Claire, "is going to produce a restitution fund. The judge overseeing the case has already been contacted about expedited processing for small business victims." She looked at Claire. "I made some calls this morning." Claire stared at her. "You've been awake all night." "So have you," Hayes said. "That's different. I work here." "You're buying here," Hayes corrected. "Which is different." She put her coffee on the counter. "The restitution fund is going to return Maggie's $400 a month for 8 months. That's $3,200. It's not collateral, but it's documented return from a federal proceeding, which some banks will weigh favorably in a small business loan application." Maggie picked up Hayes's coffee, smelled it, and put it back down with the expression of a woman confirming a professional slight. "I'll make you a proper cup," Maggie said to Hayes. "Thank you," Hayes said. Claire looked at Hayes. "Why are you here?" Hayes looked back at her steadily. "Because you walked into my meeting at Olson's with 6 weeks of self-assembled financial forensics that my team hadn't been able to produce in 2 years, she said. "And then you identified Callahan's escape route at 3 in the morning from a laptop in my back seat." She paused. "And because I've been doing this job for 18 years, And I know what it looks like when someone is going to be useful to a city, and I wanted to make sure the city doesn't lose you to something avoidable, like a bank loan application." The diner was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a project," Claire said. "No," Hayes said. "You're a witness in a federal case, an owner-operator of a business connected to that case, and a nursing student who starts in January if she accepts this letter." She looked at the letter on the counter. "Accept the letter, Claire." Claire picked it up. She looked at it for the third time in the last hour. She put it in her pocket. "I'll call them this afternoon," she said. Maggie put a fresh cup of coffee in front of Hayes. Hayes drank it, and her expression changed immediately. Involuntarily, the way people always changed when they had their first cup of something significantly better than what they'd had before. "The diner has good coffee," Say said with something approaching wonder. "It has always had good coffee," Claire said. "People just don't notice things that are consistently good. They only notice when it changes." She said it about the coffee. She was thinking about other things. The months that followed were the hardest and the most clarifying of Claire Bennett's life. The federal investigation moved with a particular momentum of something that had been building pressure for 2 years and was now finally releasing. Callahan's network collapsed with the specific efficiency of structures that look solid from the outside but have been hollowed from within fast and loud, and leaving a great deal of wreckage that had to be carefully sorted. 7 officials were arrested in the first 3 weeks. 14 additional businesses were identified as victims of the collection scheme. The Vietnamese restaurant owner on Broad Street received a check for $6,400, which was 8 months of payments returned in full, and she called the number on the accompanying letter and wept for 4 minutes at the person on the other end, who was a federal restitution coordinator named Marcus, who had taken this job specifically because it produced moments like this one, and he wanted to be present for them. Claire knew about Marcus because she asked about him when she filed her own statement, and because she had always believed that the people doing unglamorous important work deserved to be known by name. She testified twice, once in a deposition, once in a preliminary hearing that was less preliminary than initially described and required her to in a federal courthouse for 6 hours wearing the one dress she owned that looked appropriate for a federal courthouse, which she had purchased the week before at a consignment shop for $22. She told the truth both times in full, without embellishment or omission, and the federal prosecutor said afterward that she was the clearest witness he'd examined in 4 years. She took it as a compliment and also as a signal that most witnesses were either lying or confused, which seemed like a significant structural problem. Vincent cooperated with everything. She did not watch it happen in real time. She was not present for his depositions or his meetings with federal investigators, because that was his process to go through, and she was not going to orbit it like a caretaker, but she heard about it from Hayes, the compressed factual way that Hayes communicated all information, and she watched its effects in the texture of his face during the hour they shared at the diner counter each night. He looked, during those months, like a man performing the slow and painful work of becoming someone. Not performing it for her, not performing it for Hayes or the federal investigators or the city of Newark. Performing it for himself, which was the only version of it that counted. There were nights he came in and sat for his hour and talked about nothing of consequence, and she let that happen, because she had learned that the nights when nothing was said were often the nights when the most important processing was occurring. There were other nights when he arrived with the particular tension of someone who had been in a room all day with people who were taking things from him not unfairly, but taking nonetheless, and she poured his coffee and held the line and let him sit in the one place where the $1.50 was still the same as everyone else's. One night in February, he told her about the property sales. He was selling the assets connected to the criminal operations, the holdings that had been bought with money that didn't have a clean history, or that had been used as cover for operations he was now testifying against. It was a long list. He read from it without looking at her, like a man reading a confession at low volume, and she listened without interrupting, because she had asked for honesty, and honesty sometimes arrived in the form of a quiet accounting in a diner at 2 in the morning. The building on Prospect, he said. The Warehouse District Properties. The holding company that technically owned 4 of the businesses on Callahan's collection list. He paused. Some of those businesses didn't know a Moretti company was their landlord. They were paying rent to a name they didn't recognize that happened to be one of my family's shells. She looked at him. When they find out, he said, they're going to be angry. They have the right to be. Yes, she said. I don't know how to fix that part, he said. It was not a request for her to fix it for him. It was a statement of genuine uncertainty from a man who had spent his life knowing what to do about most things, and had arrived at a category of problem that his previous methods didn't reach. You probably can't fix it, she said. Not directly. Some things you can only account for. He was quiet. You show up, she said. You pay what's owed. You don't disappear when it gets uncomfortable. You let people be angry without trying to manage the anger into something more convenient. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. That's all accountability is. It's just staying in the room when the room is hard. He looked at her for a long time. I've been thinking about the logistics company, he said. The legitimate one. I want to expand the hiring program for people coming out of the system. People with records who can't get work. He paused. Not as a PR effort. Because it's the right use of something that's already running. She thought about what it meant that he'd said, not as a PR effort before she could think it. Dom wants to manage the program, he said. When his leg is better. Claire sat with that for a moment. Dom, who had been with this family for 23 years. Dom, who had walked into a warehouse on a false pretense and come out with a leg wound, and then apparently spent his recovery period, deciding that the thing he wanted to do with the second half of his career was help people rebuild theirs. Tell Dom yes, she said. Vincent nodded. She refilled his coffee. The loan came through in March. Not easily. There were 3 rounds of documentation, 2 conversations in which she had to explain herself to a banker, who seemed to believe that a waitress buying a diner was an ambitious misunderstanding, and 1 moment where the whole thing appeared to be failing because of a lien she didn't know about in Maggie's property history that had to be cleared through the county courthouse at a cost that required Claire to move money between accounts in a way that was legal but infuriating. Maggie co-signed the note, holding the balance with the particular signature of a woman who had made this decision a long time ago and was simply now making it on paper. Vincent had offered to assist with the courthouse fees. She had declined. She had asked him instead to connect her with his legitimate attorney, who charged her a flat rate for the property work and did not, as far as she could verify, do anything irregular. She verified carefully. In April, the diner closed for 2 weeks for repairs. The repairs were paid for through the restitution fund, Maggie's returned extortion money, applied directly to the property that had been harmed by the extortion, which felt, to Claire, like exactly the right use of exactly the right money. She hired 2 contractors recommended by a small business network she'd joined through the city's economic development office, both of whom were paid on time and in full, and both of whom commented afterward that this was less common than it should be. She designed the new employee handbook herself. It was 14 pages long and covered wages, scheduling, health benefits, and a section on the scholarship fund that she had been working on since January, which she called the Bennett Knight Scholarship, over Maggie's objection that it should be named after both of them. It's my diner now, Claire said. I name the scholarship. You are a very stubborn woman, Maggie said. You hired me, Claire said. So that reflects on your judgment. Maggie laughed, properly, for the first time in weeks. And the sound of it in the kitchen at 9 in the morning was one of the best things Claire had heard in a long time. Bennett's Night Kitchen opened on a Thursday evening in May. She had chosen Thursday deliberately, because Friday and Saturday openings were for places that wanted attention, and she wanted something quieter, a night where the people who came would be people who had meant to come, rather than people looking for the next new thing. She had invited specifically nurses from the hospital 2 miles over who worked the late shift and had nowhere good to go at midnight. Truck drivers who had been regulars at Maggie's for years. The owners of the businesses that had been on Callahan's collection list. She had tracked down every one of them through Hayes's case files and sent handwritten notes on plain cards. Mrs. Petrov and her daughter. Sal from the hardware store. The Vietnamese restaurant owner, whose name was Lin, and who arrived with her daughter and a container of spring rolls that she placed on the counter and said were a gift for the opening, and that Claire was caught not to argue with her about this. Claire did not argue. Gerald was there, in his usual seat at the end of the counter, which Claire had quietly designated as his, regardless of what the reservation system said, because some things about a diner were more important than systems. Hayes arrived at 11, off duty, in a jacket instead of the detective's coat, and sat in the corner booth and ordered the eggs over easy and ate them with the particular focused appreciation of someone who had been eating bad food for too long. Maggie was behind the counter at 11:30 because retirement was unbearably boring, and because she had negotiated with the particular negotiating style of a woman who had run her own business for 30 years, a standing arrangement that gave her Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning shifts in exchange for staying out of Claire's kitchen decisions. At midnight, the diner was full and warm and loud, with exactly the kind of noise that diner counters are supposed to produce: overlapping conversations, the punctuation of silverware, someone at the back table making a point strongly enough to make the couple beside them look over and then look away again. And at 14 in the morning, with the crowd thinning to the late-night regulars, the door opened. No coat soaked with rain, no blood on a white shirt, no armed men at the entrance taking inventory of exits. Just Vincent Moretti alone, in a plain jacket, looking like a man who had been walking and was ready to stop. He sat on his stool. Claire poured his coffee before he'd settled. She set it in front of him. She watched his hands wrap around the mug the way they always had, and she noticed that they were steadier than they'd been a year ago, not the white-knuckle steadiness of control, but the actual steadiness of a man who had put down enough weight to let his hands remember what rest felt like. He slid something across the counter. She looked down. An envelope. Worn at the edges. She recognized it immediately, because she had put it in an envelope herself, on a night that felt like it belonged to a different version of her life. She picked it up. Inside, folded clean and flat, were 5 $100 bills. The original $500 from the night they met. She had given it back to him 6 months ago. He was returning it now. She turned it over. On the back of the envelope, in that careful, angular handwriting she had learned to recognize across a counter in the middle of the night, he had written, "For the floor. Always." Not a debt of beginning. She read it twice. She put it on the counter between them. "You changed the message," she said. "You changed the ending," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Around them, the diner moved through its late-night rhythms, soft sound of Maggie at the register, the kitchen running its closing prep, Gerald reading his newspaper at the end of the counter like a man who had never left. "The coffee," Vincent said after a moment. He looked into the mug. "It's better than it used to be." "I changed suppliers," she said. "Better beans. The old supplier was overcharging and under-delivering, and I decided that was a pattern I was done tolerating." He almost smiled. The almost went all the way again, the way it had on the last night of the hardest year of both their lives. Small and real and completely unperformed. "How's school?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Good. The clinical rotations start in September and I'm terrified, which my professor says is the correct emotional response to having other people's health in your hands." Your professor sounds sensible. She's 63 and has been teaching nursing for 30 years, and she told me on the first day that the students she worries about are the ones who aren't scared, 'cause scared people pay attention. She paused. I liked her immediately. "Of course you did," he said. She picked up the envelope. She looked at it one more time, at his handwriting, at the money that had traveled between them twice now and arrived, finally, at the place it was supposed to be, and she put it in the register and wrote it down as paid in full. Because that was what it was, and because pretending otherwise had never been something she had the patience for. "Rules," she said, turning back to him. He looked up. Something in his eyes that was paying very careful attention. "The rules haven't changed," she said. "No weapons displayed. No business meetings. No shouting at the staff." She paused. "But I'm adding one." He waited. "You come in the front door," she said. "Same as everyone else. No side arrangements. No quiet understandings with the staff. If you want something, you ask for it out loud, in plain sight, and you accept whatever answer you get." He held her gaze for a long moment. "That's a harder rule than the others," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." "All right," he said. "I accept the terms," she said. She leaned on the counter across from him, the way she had on the second night, the night he'd apologized, and she'd poured herself a coffee for the first time during a shift and decided without deciding, the way the real decisions happened, that she was in the middle of something she didn't have a name for yet. She had a name for it now. She wasn't going to say it yet, because names made things real, and real things had consequences, and she had learned that some consequences were worth taking your time with. But she knew what it was. She had known for months. She had simply been waiting until the year was far enough along that she could trust what she was seeing, not the emergency version of him, not the crisis version, not the man making good choices because everything was on fire, and good choices were the only ones available. The ordinary version. The version that showed up at 2:14 on a Thursday night, when nothing was at stake except the coffee and the conversation and the hour of being somewhere that didn't ask him for anything except the $50 and the truth. That version had been showing up consistently for 11 months. A consistent record. She'd told him that's what it took. He'd built one. From the end of the counter, Gerald looked up from his newspaper and looked at the two of them and looked back down again, with the expression of a man who had been watching something develop for a long time and was satisfied with the direction it had taken. He said nothing. He folded his paper. At 3:02, Vincent set his empty cup on the counter. He reached into his jacket. He put $1.50 beside the cup. Exact change. The way he had for 11 months, since the night she'd told him that $500 was a statement. And she didn't need statements. She picked it up and put it in the register. "Good coffee tonight," he said. "It's always good coffee," she said. "You just finally started noticing." He stood, he put his jacket on. He looked at her, across the counter, across the cracked laminate surface, and the familiar hiss of the machine, and the 11 months of 2:14 arrivals, and $50 payments and breathing exercises, and borrowed nursing textbooks, and federal proceedings, and one very important envelope that had traveled between them twice before it found its home, and he said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed to be said, that hadn't already been said in the manner that actually counted, which was not words but actions, and not promises but presence, and not the performance of change but the slow and unglamorous and completely real work of it. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back, just far enough to look at her over his shoulder. "Same time tomorrow," he said. She picked up the coffee pot. "Same rules," she said. He left. And Claire Bennett stood alone in her diner, at 3:04 in the morning, her diner, with her name above the door, and her scholarship fund in the employee handbook, and her nursing textbooks in her bag and her hands, steady as they had always been, wrapped around a coffee pot that had poured 10,000 cups of ordinary courage into the dark hours of this city, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a life that had been bent out of shape for too long finally returned to its true form. Not dramatic, not sudden, not the result of a single brave moment, or a man with power, or a check large enough to change the arithmetic. The result of 1,000 small refusals to be made smaller. The result of rules held, lines kept, truths told plainly, and the patient, daily, undramatic choice to remain exactly who she was until the world had no choice but to make room for her. She had not been saved. She had not been lifted. She had not traded one cage for a nicer one. She had simply refused to flinch, and then she had built something worth not flinching for. The coffee machine hissed. The counter was clean. The door was open.